My name is Woonkyung Yeo from the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations from SNU. And I thank you so much for coming for this lecture in this sunny afternoon. I'm pleased to have Professor Martin Grossheim for the lecture hosted by Institute of Asian Studies and Comparative Studies of East Asian Humanities. Professor Grossheim is a professor of Department of History, SNU, and he has been one of the leading scholars in the field of contemporary history of Vietnam and Vietnam War history. And he has published many articles and book chapters on diverse topics on Vietnam War history. For example, this year he published a chapter of Cambridge History of Vietnam War, arguably one of the best and significant collections of scholarly works on the topic. And his recent research interest is regarding memory, especially the dynamics and politics of memory of war in Vietnam. His monograph titled The Politics of Memory in Socialist Vietnam was published by the SNU Press last year. I think memory is a new trend and important field of study in contemporary history, especially in the study of war and violence and massacre, in that the war is first fought in the battleground and then fought in the memory of people. This is in line with the new trend in Cold War studies, which he will talk about today. Like the Vietnam War, like many wars, was mainly interpreted in and understood in terms of international politics, diplomacy, and military issues. The superpowers like the US and the Soviet Union were always the main players in those narratives. The new Cold War history attempts to explore and emphasize the agency of small countries and peoples, and be oriented towards the topics beyond politics, such as socio-cultural relations inside the bloc and memory politics during and after the war. So new sources and new approaches have been explored to study Cold War. Studying the Vietnam War, one of the biggest hard wars in Cold War period, is definitely influenced by the new Cold War history. As the title, the Vietnamization, shows, the new trend in Vietnam War studies focuses on the agents and the visibility of Vietnamese, especially the people who actually experienced the war on the spot. The detailed story will be presented by Professor Grossheim. Please welcome Professor Martin Grossheim.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Many thanks to the Institute of Asian Studies for inviting me, and thank you for coming today. Many of you might know in a few weeks, on the 30th of April, Vietnam will commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And on this short excursion, we went to Central Vietnam, and Central Vietnam was liberated a few weeks earlier. So Da Nang and Hue, where we were liberated on the 26th and on the 29th of March. So these places were decorated with with the national flag that you see here, with the propaganda posters and so on. So the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War is a big event in Vietnam, and the party, as I call it, the memory machine, will make full of use of that, and I will try to monitor that. But today I will not talk so much about memory, but I will talk on new trends in Vietnam War studies. So first I just show a few pictures that illustrate the end of the war. So what you see here, that was the 30th of April 1975. So you see military boots and fatigues hastily discarded by South Vietnamese soldiers. That means soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, of South Vietnam, that state backed by the United States that collapsed on that day. Okay, so Vietnam was temporarily divided in 1954 after the end of the first Vietnam War, when France had tried to reimpose colonial rule. And so the North then was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a socialist one-party state, with Ho Chi Minh as president, and the Vietnamese Workers' Party in charge. So North Vietnam tried to build up socialism, and the so-called State of Vietnam, later it was renamed Republic of Vietnam, was backed by the United States and transformed into like an anti-communist bulwark. And the conflict escalated at the beginning of the 1960s, and then in 1964, the so-called the Second Vietnam War broke out, but now the United States intervened directly, and so as we all know, in 1975, the United States lost this war, but that was the first time that the United States were defeated on the battlefield. Okay, so victorious North Vietnamese army enters Saigon on 30th of April on that very day, and as you see here, this was not a guerrilla army, but this was a modern army equipped with state-of-the-art weapons made in the Soviet Union. Some weapons were also made in other socialist countries. Okay, so my talk will be on, first of all, on new trends in Vietnam War studies. And then I will talk a bit about my own research, because my own research is also situated within these new Vietnam War studies. And at the end, I will try to answer a bit the question whether all this new research that has been going on and that has produced lots of new books in the last 2 or 3 decades has had any influence in Vietnam itself, especially on Vietnamese historiography in Vietnam. So in the last few decades, Vietnam War studies have been influenced by what is called New Cold War history. So that's a term that was coined by John Geddes. And this new Cold War history or new interpretations of the Cold War were made possible by the collapse of the socialist bloc starting in 1989, lasting until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so this was linked with so all this caused the opening of Soviet, East European, actually also Central European, Chinese and other archives to scholars. So before, Vietnam War scholars could only make use of archival documents, of source material in Western countries, and mostly in the US. But it is not only about new source material. New Cold War history also follows a new approach, so that is decentering the interpretation of the Cold War, and this is characterized by a shift from a focus on the superpowers, that means United States and Soviet Union, to the study of the role of smaller countries during the Cold War. So this new approach led to an interesting phenomenon that in English is called to emphasize, the significance of smaller countries. So in English, this is called the tail wags the dog, not the other way around. Yeah? So that means, I quote here, the periphery feeding on and contributing to the central dynamics of the East-West contest. Centers of action far from Moscow and Washington, in Bonn and Berlin, Pyongyang and Havana, and so on and so on. A history where these people are seen more as effective subjects and less as manipulated objects of the course of events. Unquote. And Vietnam War studies, as I said, have also been part of this new Cold War history, but there are also some how to say, intrinsic developments in Vietnam War studies. So they have been influenced by shifts in the international context. So of course also the end of the Cold War, by the establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and Vietnam in 1995, and of course also by domestic developments in Vietnam itself. So, and that is the beginning or the embarkment on the so-called Noi Mới policy. Doi Moi means reform policy. So what the Vietnamese leadership calls officially the market-oriented reforms. So these reforms are actually quite similar to what happened in China a decade earlier and what had been initiated by Deng Xiaoping. And after socialism collapsed in Central and Eastern Europe, the Vietnamese leadership also launched a so-called open door policy. That means almost overnight, Vietnam had lost all its allies, and now it had to find new allies, and it did so very successfully by launching this so-called open door policy. So as a result, Vietnam normalized relations with China, it normalized relations with the US, and became member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And against this backdrop, the opening of Vietnam, beginning of the reform period in Vietnam, there has been an increased interest in Vietnam in general and in Vietnamese studies in particular. And there is a special phenomenon, and that is members of the Vietnamese diaspora, especially in the US, but not only in the US, and in particular the second generation Vietnamese, are increasingly interested in the history of their homeland, or, to be more precise, the homeland of their parents. And since the beginning of the 1990s, there are also better, much improved research opportunities in Vietnam. So there is at least limited access to archives, and these days it is possible to do field research in Vietnam. So, for example, I myself did field research in villages in the Red River Delta in North Vietnam and in the Mekong Delta in South Vietnam in 1996, 97, and it was possible. Of course, there was some, we were monitored, but it was possible. Okay, improved research opportunities in Vietnam, also accompanied by an upsurge in Southeast Asian studies. So there is an increase in numbers of scholars with good Vietnamese language proficiency who can make efficient use of Vietnamese language sources. So until the end of the 1980s, or let's say mid-1990s, Vietnam War studies were dominated by diplomatic historians who usually only made use of American sources, English language source material. And this has changed significantly. And of course, what also helped is another factor, that is, the increased interconnectedness due to social media, which also helped, to establish like an international Vietnam studies community. And so this community, these days is quite well connected, also quite well connected to colleagues in Vietnam itself. Okay, so what took place against this background is the Vietnamization of Vietnam studies, and in particular of Vietnam studies, in particular of Vietnam War studies. So the Vietnam War is not just presented as an episode in US history, with Vietnamese and other non-American actors only playing marginal roles, mainly relying on American sources. So actually what happened in the Vietnam War studies or what Vietnam War studies looked like is similar to how, Hollywood movies back in the 1980s presented the Vietnam War. So they also usually focused on the experience of U.S. soldiers, of GIs, and you only very rarely could see Vietnamese soldiers or Vietnamese citizens. So now the focus is on the Vietnamese dimensions on the war. A quote here from a programmatic article: on the roles played by various Vietnamese groups and individuals, and on the sources that illuminate Vietnamese decisions and motives, unquote. And, quote, on the extraordinary and deliberate efforts of the Vietnamese leaders to turn superpower rivalry to their advantage, unquote. So, of course, superpower rivalry here means the rivalry between the Soviet Union and China. So the leaders in Hanoi were very, very, very successfully managed to play Beijing and Moscow against each other. So they received both military assistance and economic assistance from the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. So the agencies of Vietnamese players has been emphasized. And of course, this all takes into account that the Vietnam War, I mean, I'm talking now about this, the US war, right? That this war was mainly a Vietnamese experience. So, and most of the victims, the vast majority of the victims were Vietnamese. And the number of American, US soldiers who died in Vietnam was huge. It was 58,000 GIs died in Vietnam. But, if you compare that with like 2 million Vietnamese civilians who died in the conflict, along with 1.3 million Vietnamese soldiers, then it's obvious that this war was mainly, a Vietnamese experience. Okay, so some years ago, like 15, 16 years ago, this programmatic article was published in the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. So Vietnam War as a Vietnamese War, Agency and Society in the Study of the Second Indochina War. And these two authors, Edward Miller and Dung Vu, they have published lots of important studies on the Vietnam War. Okay, so in more detail then, what is this all about, these Vietnam War studies? So what are the new findings? So firstly, during the Vietnam War, observers abroad and also politicians like Lyndon B. Johnson, thought that the, North Vietnam, for example, was a totalitarian state, and that the leadership in Hanoi was absolutely monolithic, that there were no factions in the Hanoi leadership. And in addition to that, during the Vietnam War and also in the decades later after the war, usually people thought that Ho Chi Minh was the dominant leader in Hanoi. But these new studies have emphasized the complexity of the decision-making process among communist leaders in Hanoi, and they have reassessed the role of Ho Chi Minh. So they have revealed that instead of being the pivotal leader all the way to his death in 1969, Ho Chi Minh actually lost a great deal of influence at the beginning of the 1960s, and that in fact, Le Duan, an obscure politician in the West during the war, dominated decision-making at the time. So it was Le Duan who was elected party secretary general in 1960, who dominated decision-making in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and right until his death in 1986. So lots of new studies, lots of new books have been published who emphasize new findings. So I just present a few examples so you can better imagine. So this is a book, for example, by Alec Holcomb. It's about North Vietnam in the 1960s based on Vietnamese sources. So it's about the domestic situation in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam that had been established or founded by Ho Chi Minh in 1945. And he analyzes the development until the end of the 1950s, especially building up of socialism, mainly influenced by Chinese Maoism until 1956-57. And this is a typical example and very impressive example of a publication by a representative of the second generation American Vietnamese. Her name is Nguyen Lien Hang. She now teaches at Columbia University. So you see from the title, this is not the United States in Vietnam or whatever. It's Hanoi's war. So she emphasizes the role of the Hanoi leadership, especially in the wake of the war. And so this is all about domestic politics in North Vietnam. And this book here is has a similar tendency. So this, you see from the title. So this is Hanoi's Road to the Vietnam War, 1945 to 1965, written by Pierre Esselin, who just published the second edition of his book, Vietnam's American War. Of course, this also emphasizes the agency of Vietnamese politicians. And in this book, he, and also the other colleagues, the Vietnam War is presented as a complex and also morally ambiguous conflict. So not as a morality play. Maybe some of you study English literature, so a morality play is like a battle between good and evil, right? So these books present the war in a more nuanced way, So they try to focus on the gray areas, between black and white. And what is important is also it is not only presented as the largest, longest, and bloodiest conflict of the Cold War, of course, but also as a civil war. And just in brackets, in Vietnam itself, a person who claims that the Vietnam War was a civil war between Vietnamese, between North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese, or between Vietnamese who had different political tendencies. So a person who makes a claim like this might get into trouble, because this is not in line with the orthodox version of Vietnamese history that it has been propagated in Vietnam for decades now. Okay, so secondly, these new Vietnam War studies have also revealed details of North Vietnam interaction with its socialist allies during the Vietnam War, such as the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and other smaller socialist countries, such as the German Democratic Republic. And of course, this has been possible because new source material in the archives in Beijing, in Moscow, and also in the case of Germany, in the let's say East German archives, has become accessible, or became accessible after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of socialism. So here, this is a book, for example, on China and the Vietnam Wars. So by a Chinese historian who I think he teaches in the US. So this is the first comprehensive analysis of the role of the People's Republic of China in the first and also in the second Indochina War. And so this book is mainly based on Chinese sources. And he emphasizes that the significant role of Chinese assistance, military assistance, but also economic assistance to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So he elaborates on this in detail, and he says, China provided almost everything, from items of daily use, from toothpaste to whatever food and dried food, to smaller weapons, but China also sent about, in some, I think, more than 300,000 soldiers to North Vietnam. These soldiers did not participate, in battles with the United States directly, but they were in charge of repairing the infrastructure in the Vietnamese border provinces, and some of them even meant anti-aircraft guns. So the Chinese contribution to the victory of Vietnam over the United States is emphasized in this book. And so books have also been written on the contribution of the Soviet Union to North Vietnam's war effort against the United States. So these books here are the most outstanding ones, written by the late Ilya Gaiduk, who of course made use of the Russian archives that were accessible at least in the 1990s, before Putin came to power. And in his second book, The Soviet Union and the Vietnam War, he makes clear that the Soviet military assistance to North Vietnam was instrumental. So when the US started to send B-52 bombers to North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese leaders were in desperate need of sophisticated weaponry, anti-aircraft guns and so on, and also planes. And the Soviet Union sent all this state-of-the-art weaponry. But nevertheless, this never translated actually into any influence, or let's say considerable influence of the Soviet leadership on decision-making in Hanoi. So new studies also explore the Vietnam's conflicts, international ramifications, and locate the communist victory in Vietnam in a global context. And the book that is now considered to be the standard publication on this overall topic is The Global Cold War, written by the Norwegian historian Odd Arne Westad. So this is all about the impact of the Vietnam War on revolutionary struggles elsewhere in the Third World. So revolutionary struggles that, for example, felt inspired, by this let's say, glorious victory of North Vietnam, in 1975. And it's also on the influence of the Vietnam War on social protest movements around the world. So you might know, for example, that during the war there was a Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War protest movement, not in the US, but in lots of Western countries. Okay, and thirdly, new research has reassessed the nature of the South Vietnamese state that existed between 1954 and 1975. So previously, the South Vietnamese state that had been backed and supported by the United States was usually presented as a puppet. So in Vietnamese, this is still the case. It's always called Nguy, that means puppet. A puppet of the United States, an artificial creation completely dependent on US economic military aid without any legitimacy. Okay, and new scholarship has shown that the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem, who ruled until 1963, in particular, had his own agenda and possessed a degree of legitimacy and also popular support, although in the end he failed. He was assassinated in a coup d'etat. He failed to expand his bases further into the South Vietnamese population. So researchers like Edward Miller, they explore, also in this case, the gray areas. So they don't present now Ngo Dinh Diem as a hero, or, they don't praise him, but at least they say he had his own agenda. In the end, he failed, but he had his own agenda and he was not a puppet of the Americans. So this is another example of, publication of this, like a second generation American Vietnamese, published 3 years ago. And so in the last few years, lots of new books came out, that reassess the history of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, like this book here, The Republic of Vietnam, 1955 to 1975. And this just came out at the end of last year. So a displaced nation, the 1954 evacuation and the political impact on the Vietnam War. So this is all about the after 1954, after the end of the First Vietnam War, Vietnamese were allowed to either stay in North or South Vietnam or to migrate to the other part, to move to the other part of Vietnam. And that's what many Vietnamese did. About 800,000 Vietnamese decided to move to South Vietnam. And this book analyzes this wave of migration that was one of the biggest migration wave in modern Vietnamese history. And lastly, new scholarship has also increasingly studied how the Vietnamese one-party state and the Vietnamese themselves have commemorated the war. So there is a very interesting book written by a Korean colleague, Hon-ik Kwon, After the Massacre, Commemoration and Consolation in Ha My and My Lai. I guess some of you might have heard about the massacre of US troops in My Lai, and Ha My relates to a massacre committed by South Korean soldiers. And this colleague, an anthropologist, he did field research in these two in these two locations, and he interviewed villagers who had witnessed these two massacres and tried to find out, how they, coped, how they had come to terms with the war, with their horrible experiences, and how they commemorate these massacres. And so my book also just came out, and this is more about how the Vietnamese, so this focuses more on how the Vietnamese party state, one-party state, tries to keep control of how the past is commemorated. So the Cambridge history of the Vietnam War that just came out at the end of last year is a synthesis of this new Vietnam War scholarship, and it's, by the way, it's available online. So if you enter Seoul National University Library website, you get access. Okay, and so I also contributed a chapter, and this chapter is about domestic politics in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, 1963-1968, and in this chapter I also analyze a few things that actually are already mentioned. And I just wanted to present, as an example, of what kind of material I use. So I made extensive use of the East German archive. So, because for me, that was the easiest choice because I'm German. So reports, for example, of the GDR embassy, so GDR's German Democratic Republic, East German embassy in Hanoi. Reports of the GDR Foreign Ministry on the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And then I found the reports of East German journalists that were based in Hanoi from the end of the 1950s until the end, the end of the German Democratic Republic. And maybe the most interesting source for me were files of the former East German Ministry of State Security, commonly known as Stasi. So files of the GDR Ministry of State Security. And I was lucky because after the wall fell, the German wall, the Stasi tried very hard to destroy files. So they shredded files, they burned files, and so on. But for whatever reason, files on the cooperation between North Vietnam and the GDR, and the security service of both countries, survived, so to say. And I also made use of contemporary Vietnamese language sources, such as newly released histories of the Vietnamese Ministry of Public Security. And lastly, I also did interviews with Vietnamese cadres and intellectuals. Okay, just to give you some examples. So this here, for example, is one of those reports of an East German journalist who was based in Hanoi, and he writes about the domestic political situation in September 1963. And this is a Stasi file, letter from the North Vietnamese Minister of Public Security, Chan Quoc Hoan, to his East German colleague Erich Mielke from November 1965. Okay, so my questions were, what role did President Ho Chi Minh play in the 1960s? And was the Vietnamese Workers' Party so monolithic, unified as it is usually presented? So, and my sources also show quite clearly that this was not the case, so that actually Ho Chi Minh, who dominated decision making in Vietnam, in North Vietnam until the end of the 1950s, was sidelined, and Le Duan, he became number one in Hanoi, but he was almost unknown in the West, or especially in the United States. Okay, so this is Ho Chi Minh, of course, and this is Le Duan. So what took place at the beginning of the 1960s was factional infighting in Hanoi. So there was, let's say, a hawkish or a militant faction led by Le Duan, who regarded militant struggle, war, as the only way to achieve reunification. And he was prepared to throw a lot of, how to say, resources and also blood into this war effort. On the other side, there was a moderate faction, a more moderate faction, including the famous General Vuong Nguyen Giap, who favored a more cautious approach and who, warned against U.S. intervention. But in the end, this hawkish faction led by Le Duan prevailed, and that was in 1963. So, and all this was, interestingly, all monitored very closely by the East German embassy. So they had, at that time, at least at that time, they still had quite impressive sources of information. So at a plenum in December 1963, the party leadership in Hanoi agreed on a more aggressive approach to the unification of the country. And those party members who favored a more moderate strategy were sidelined and even targeted during a so-called campaign against modern revisionism in 1964. So Ho Chi Minh, now he was step by step marginalized. And this campaign against so-called revisionist tendencies also aimed, so this was also carried out in culture. So, for example, the Russian Soviet films that had been very popular in North Vietnam were all banned because they had presented the Second World War, of course, the Second World War in a different way. So they had also shown like the dark side of the war, and so this was considered to be taboo in North Vietnam in those days. And Vietnamese students studying in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries were called back because the leadership in Hanoi was afraid that those students had been exposed to, revisionist tendencies. So they had to be, so they were called back and then forced to take part in, let's say, re-education courses. The man who carried out this campaign was Le Duc Tho, who later became known as the counterpart of Henry Kissinger during the Paris peace talks. Okay, I skipped this. And so this is these are some Vietnamese students studying in the GDR in East Germany. And so I found some Stasi files that also monitored this attempt of Hanoi to call the students back. So North Vietnamese students, in studying in the GDR, were also monitored by the East German Stasi. The security services are, they don't trust anybody, so they also monitored students from Vietnam, from socialist North Vietnam. Of course, then in 1965, the war started, and after, having, emphasized this, or having carried out this campaign against revisionist tendencies and criticized the Soviet Union, now North Vietnam started to receive massive economic and military assistance from the Soviet Union, also from China and other socialist countries. And this assistance was instrumental to sustain the North Vietnamese war effort, and also instrumental for the economic survival of the North Vietnamese population. And starting in 1965, and that is something I found in these Stasi files, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam also started to receive technical assistance to modernize its security apparatus. So, for example, the East German Stasi helped to build the Office of Technical Service within the Vietnamese Ministry of Public Security. So this is an Office of Technical Service. So this is an office that produces technical equipment to carry out operational security activities. So, for example, bugs or, spy cameras and so on. And the East German Stasi was very good in that. So North Vietnam received what was called solidarity shipments. So that was a picture taken in 1979. So what you see is Interflug, that was the East German carrier at that time. So just one concrete example, how the East Germans helped the North Vietnamese Security Service. There were lots of, let's say, communist cadres in South Vietnam who lived, in secret, and who every now and then were, checked by the South Vietnamese police. And at the end of the 1960s, the South Vietnamese government had introduced new identity cards, and with the support of the United States, and it was very difficult to produce fake identity cards. So if a communist cadre in South Vietnam was controlled by the police and he could not show a real identity card, then he was in trouble. And the North Vietnamese Security Service could not produce these fake identity cards because they lacked a special kind of paper. So they asked their East German comrades to help, and they actually had to buy this special kind of paper in Switzerland. Anyway, in the end, the Hanoi Ministry of Public Security could produce these fake identity cards, and everything was okay. Okay, so this is the Vietnamese minister of Chan Quoc Hoan inspecting technical equipment for, laminating people's identity cards for use in South Vietnam in 1977. So the East German Stasi, for example, provided bugs and other, surveillance equipment. And this surveillance equipment then actually was also used in North Vietnam to monitor the North Vietnamese population. All right. So 1968 was a turning point in the war. That was the Tet Offensive. That was actually a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, but it was, a propaganda victory. But before North Vietnam launched this offensive, one of the largest purges in the history of the Vietnamese Communist Party took place. So hundreds, and this is what I found out in East German sources, and also in talks with Vietnamese cadres in Hanoi. So hundreds of moderate cadres who had already dared to speak out against the militant line of Le Duan back in 1963, and whom Le Duan did not deem fully trustworthy, disappeared in remote prisons for years until 1972, 1973. So this is an example of internal factional infighting in North Vietnam, and so this shows once more that the leadership in Hanoi was not monolithic, and the victims of this affair this purge have not been rehabilitated yet. So, and this affair is one of the taboo topics in present-day Vietnam. So usually Vietnamese students, for example, will know, living in Vietnam, who learned history in Vietnamese schools, they usually don't know anything about this. Okay, so this was all about, new tendencies of Vietnam War studies, and then, a short try to show a bit, and what, the findings of my research, and also, on what kind of sources my research was based. And now I wanted to talk at least a bit at the end about, the question, has the new scholarship found its way into official Vietnamese historiography? Especially, now we are, approaching the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, and lots of new books will be published in Vietnam on this event. So there is this new multi-volume history of Vietnam that was published a few years ago by the Institute of History, and I managed to get the PDF files because these 15 books are just too heavy. So I had to look at that, and what I found out is that I had to look at the bibliography, and those volumes that on the, let's say, modern Vietnamese history that cover the Vietnam War or the post-war development almost make let's put it like this, almost make no use of any in English language books on Vietnam that were published in the last 2 or 3 decades. And in fact, it's, let's say it's even worse than that. Books that represent new trends in Vietnam War studies are usually trashed in Vietnamese state media. So every now and then you find book reviews like this here, and this was published in Nhân Dân, which is the party newspaper. Nhân Dân means the people. And this article trashes this book, Hanoi's War by Nguyen Thi Lien Hang, that I presented before. And it says, don't distort history in the name of science. And so this is a buzzword in Vietnam, distort. People try to distort history. So in the Vietnamese state media, you will find lots of articles that warn against a tendency to distort history. Yeah. So Voice of Vietnam, distorting and demanding a revision of history, new guys, old plot. Or here in Liberated Saigon, Saigon Saigon, being vigilant against arguments of hostile forces that distort, misrepresent, and revise history. And a few years ago, a series of articles appeared on the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it presented lessons that the Vietnamese leadership should or has drawn, from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one is, for example, not to make one of Gorbachev's main mistakes, that is, quote, starting to revise history, to defame leaders, and to smear the patriotic war, unquote. Of course, to defame leaders in this respect means to defame Stalin, and to smear the patriotic war, of course, means to smear, the Second World War. So Vietnam will not make this mistake, and interestingly, in here, Vietnam actually follows the Chinese model, because China under Xi Jinping also emphasizes that, there is like one correct version of history, that and that those who try to challenge this official version of history that the state media and official historiography propagate, that those people do what is called historical nihilism. So if you have a look at very boring Vietnamese party resolutions, then like this here, then you will see this is a long resolution, but it is very important from that 2016. So it warns against manifestations of self-evolution and self-transformation among party members, and this shows, for example, in tendencies among certain party members of the Vietnamese Communist Party to distort history, make fabrications or slanders against predecessor leaders and party and state leaders. So, in other words, the Vietnamese one-party state and, the propaganda machine and so on, they also claim that there is just one correct version of history that, of course, the party knows and propagates, and that those who challenge this version distort history. Okay, as I said, these days, and actually for a few weeks already, Vietnam has been preparing for the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And so on the left side, you see this is 50 years of the liberation of the South and of the reunification of the country. So that will take place on 30th of April. And on the right, you see a picture of troops, already, preparing, for the like a victory march, that will take place on the 30th of April in Ho Chi Minh City, as it is known, as it is called now. So I will monitor, these events, and will, also try to find some, I still hope, that maybe in the long run, Vietnamese historiography will, take up at least part of this new Vietnam War scholarship. But I must admit that I'm not very very optimistic. On the other hand, I know also that lots of Vietnamese historians are aware of this new Vietnam War scholarship. I mean, books published abroad. They might not be allowed to buy hard copies of those books, but of course these days it's very easy to buy ebooks. And so the only thing is that they don't dare yet, to use these findings in their own publications in Vietnam. But maybe in the future they will do that. Thank you very much.
So if you have any questions or comments about the talk, please.
I'm Mr. Kang of Asian History Department. My question about the historiography of Vietnam, so social Vietnam is focused on the last chapter that talks about the historiography after 1991, the Soviet collapse.
Mm-hmm.
I know that after 1991, the Communist Party had made the so-called Ho Chi Minh thought as the party's main ideology, and it is also coincide with the Soviet collapse. But actually, I know that before 1991, Vietnam had maintained the orthodoxy of Marxism-Leninism, not like China, not like Chinese Communist Party, which had already made the Mao Zedong thought as their main ideology before the World War II. So my question is that after 1991, what made the Vietnam Communist Party to explain their ideology that is original in Vietnam and originated from Vietnam and nationalized by Vietnam?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, of course, you're absolutely right that the People's Republic of China had already propagated the Maoism, or the ideology that of Mao for many decades, and Socialist Vietnam only really started to do that in 1991. That's absolutely right. So these days, just to illustrate this, for Vietnamese students who study at Vietnamese universities, I mean, it's mandatory to attend classes on the so-called Ho Chi Minh ideas. Okay, but your question was, why did the Vietnamese leadership introduced the so-called Ho Chi Minh ideology in 1991, and in the first half of the 1990s they started to do this. So it was because of the collapse of socialism. So the leadership, the Vietnamese leadership, had the impression that just to rely on Marxism-Leninism as a source of legitimacy, and also on history as a source of legitimacy, might not be enough. The Vietnamese Communist Party still talks a lot about socialism, and Vietnamese students also have to, it's also mandatory for them to learn, Marxist-Leninist ideology. But the Vietnamese leadership, the party leadership, of course, was aware that Marxism-Leninism at that time, against the backdrop of the collapse of socialism, of almost all the socialist allies of Vietnam, that Marxism-Leninism had lost much of its, attraction, and also, the Vietnamese party leadership also was aware and still is aware that although it just calls these reforms that it launched in 1986 and in the following years market-oriented reforms, but in fact it's nothing else than introducing capitalism. Okay, Ho Chi Minh never had the ambition to develop his own ideology. And what you can buy in Vietnamese bookshops, on last Sunday when we were in Da Nang, we went to one of those. We happened to find a bookshop, a state bookshop, and there was one corner that was full with books written by Ho Chi Minh. So, and he has actually written on almost everything, on each and every topic. But it's how to say, it's full of Confucian morals, and it's very, general and so on. He is not so he, as I said, he never had the ambition to produce like an original ideology. But the Vietnamese party leadership thought that at that point, against the backdrop of the collapse of socialism, they needed another source of legitimacy. And so since then, they have made it mandatory to learn, to study Marxism-Leninism, and also they have developed the Ho Chi Minh cult. So now in every province in Vietnam, you see huge statues of Ho Chi Minh, and you see Ho Chi Minh museums, and so on and so on.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture, Professor. My question is on the official history of Vietnam that's published in 2015, and and you mentioned that in the bibliography they rarely use English sources or updates on like international scholarships, and they like attack on the new trends as nihilism or something. But my question stems from that the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Institute of History updates their history, right? And like if they do, what material do they use, or like if it's maybe related to the question before, like just before, like if the what new historical materials do they use, or like do they just use them to like update their party ideology or something? I was wondering that part.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe first of all, I can add a bit, about what I said about this, for example, this multi-volume history. Of course, it's how to say, maybe it's a bit too easy just to say, in the bibliography, I didn't find any of those books who represent these new Vietnam War studies. But I also had a look at, what do they write about certain topics, and it's obvious that they still systematically avoid certain taboo or certain, in Vietnam it's called complicated topics, right? And so, for example, post-war development, which of course is a huge issue in the overseas Vietnamese community. Like why did so many Vietnamese leave Vietnam after 1975? Almost 1 million. Almost nothing in this multi-volume history. And the war in general is presented, I exaggerate now a bit, but is presented as a war of the against American imperialism by the Vietnamese people under the leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party. What is quite new in this multi-volume history is that not always, but sometimes when they write about the Republic of Vietnam, they don't say this is a puppet government. So this was, quite, in Vietnamese terms, quite revolutionary. But, that was almost the only thing that I could discover. And but you ask about also what kind of sources did they make use of? And so they mostly make use of like official party documents. There is a collection of party documents that was published a few years ago. And the Journal of Vietnamese Studies that also mentioned in one of those slides has a special issue on this collection of party documents. And several colleagues, they had a look at these party documents. They are available. You can download it from the internet. And they say it's an interesting source, but these party documents have been edited. So that means they have been, censored. They have been edited. And then what also, many of my colleagues find quite, striking is that so many foreign scholars go to the archives in Vietnam. So these days it is possible to go to the archives, and if you are lucky, you even get access to files. But you only very rarely see Vietnamese scholars. Vietnamese scholars from Vietnam, sitting there and having a look at the files. I just, mention this as a matter of fact. I don't say this is good or bad, or I don't criticize, let's say my colleagues in Vietnam, because I know some quite well personally, and I know so they have, they're in very, they face lots of problems, so they are in a difficult situation. And they have to survive, right? So historiography in Vietnam is still closely controlled by the party state, and it's so it's very challenging to for example, to teach Vietnamese history in Vietnam. So you have to be very careful. So I don't want to, I just want to emphasize this. I don't want to, to criticize my colleagues, but this is just, as I just state, this is a matter of fact. There are not really lots of new things in this multi-volume history, and just remember this: the editor-in-chief. He made an interview, and he was quite outspoken. He said, "Yeah, I'm really sorry. In this book, we could not yet address certain complicated topics like this and this and this. Like he even said like this purge that happened in 1967. Of course, they know everything, but he said, it's now it is not possible yet because it's too complicated. Phức tạp quá. It's too complicated."
Thank you for the great lecture. I really appreciate it. I'm Eugene Kang, a master's degree student in the Department of Asian History. So my question is also about the use of historical materials by foreign researchers in Vietnam. So on your last part of your presentation, you said that Vietnamese Communist Party controls the way the history is written. So the historiography. Yeah, sorry. So, but at the same time, on the first part of the presentation, you also mentioned that it is at least possible to do the field research in Vietnam and to get access to historical documents about especially the war. But so here I don't expect that it'll be 100% free to get access to all those documents, but I'm not sure how much it is limited or restricted to get those documents. So at least getting access to historical materials itself, is it free or is it quite restricted even now?
Yeah, okay. That's a very complicated question. But of course it's very good. So just to illustrate, the change that Vietnam has witnessed. So when I was in Vietnam for the first time in 1987, the Cold War was still going on, right? And so there was still Vietnam. Vietnam was, part of the socialist world, and I was one of the few capitalist students. So there was this clear division, capitalist students and socialist students, and they said we, the capitalist students, we were obviously closely monitored, and but it was okay, right? But at that time, for example, I was not able to visit a Vietnamese in his private house. Not possible. I wouldn't have been in trouble, but the Vietnamese, my Vietnamese host. Okay. So in 1996, 1997, I did field research. So I went to villages, and so this was mainly about developments in Vietnam in the countryside after the beginning of the reform period. But because I'm a historian, of course, then I tried to take the opportunity to talk with older people about topics that I'm interested in, like North Vietnam in the 1950s. They carried out a very radical land reform. And first it was very difficult, and we were monitored, but then after some time I was able to talk quite freely with villagers. I did field research archival research in 1992, 1993, but that was on the French colonial period. So there was no problem. But then I asked for some files about border provinces to China, and they said, please don't do research about the border area because this is sensitive. So as soon as somehow China was involved, it doesn't work. I went to the archives once more, and actually to do research about what I presented, this domestic politics in North Vietnam. And after a long time, I was allowed to enter the archives, but in the end, I did not receive a single file, because I think they knew what I was looking for, and they knew that this topic was too sensitive. So, to answer your question a bit more, it depends very much on the topic. It depends very much on how you present it, but it can also depend on the current political situation in Vietnam. For example, it is not a good idea to go to Vietnam for research in general, just before prior to a National Party Congress, because usually at that time the Vietnamese security service, the Ministry of Public Security, is just crazy. They and I know that they monitor especially Vietnam. Foreign Vietnam scholars who speak Vietnamese. Everybody knows. Yeah. So it very much depends. Some of those authors that I presented, like Pierre Esselin, for example, he got access to lots of interesting sources in the Vietnamese archives, files of the Vietnamese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's absolutely impossible for foreign scholars to get access to the party archives. This is, in my lifetime, and maybe, I think also in my next life, I will not have a chance to go to the party archives.
Good afternoon, and I'm a visiting scholar at the SNU Asia Center. So, Professor, thank you so much for your insightful presentation and your comprehensive review of the scholarship of the Vietnam War. So I face a question regarding the historiography of the writing of Vietnam War. So in your presentation, there was rather limited discussion on the contributions of Korean scholars to this discipline. So from your perspective, how significant is the Korean or the broader Northeast Asian perspective in the study of the Vietnam War? And additionally, in what ways might the study of the Vietnam War inform or offer reflections on the historiography of Korean history itself?
Yeah, thank you. This, of course, that's a legitimate question. So contribution of Korean scholars to this, Vietnam War studies, and I think I mentioned I guess the most prominent example, that is Honnie Kwon, who wrote several books on the Vietnam War and who did field research and who also speaks Vietnamese, and of course there are many others. The thing is that, as far as I understand, if I'm wrong, then the better. Most of their publications are in Korean, and which I don't speak or I don't read. But I know, for example, that there are also, or I came across when preparing for courses on the Vietnam War and other seminars, I also came across quite a few Korean language studies. I mean, recently published, for example, on the South Korea's contribution to the Vietnam War, because this is a very, I guess, quite sensitive topic still in South Korea. So, as you know, South Korea was one of the few countries that sent soldiers to Vietnam, supporting the United States, and they made a significant contribution, and so as Honnie Kwon also did research on that. So there were some South Korean soldiers committed atrocities, and so in present day South Korea, this is a topic that I understand many South Korean scholars pay a lot of attention to. So of course it would be great if some of those studies would be translated or published in English.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm the graduate student of the Asian History Department, Kim Chan-wook. And what I want to ask is about the international aspects about Vietnam War, especially in the Southeast Asia, because there was a war at the same time at Laos and Cambodia then. And at the same year, 1975, the communist regime was established there. And what I want to ask is that you told us that new studies are very interested in sources other than Soviet Union or United States. So is there any trial or trends that want to use the source of the Cambodian or Laotian ones, and is there any trend that focused on that relationship with their regimes?
Yeah, it's a good question. And of course, during my talk, I usually said Vietnam War or Second Vietnam War, but many colleagues, and usually me too, I actually, one could also say Indochina War, because this, the whole of Indochina was a battlefield already during the first war against the French, and the second war was also it took place in the whole of Indochina. That means also Laos and Cambodia. So, of course, the revolutionary struggle. Let's use this word, this term. This is officially used in Hanoi. Of the Vietnamese people was closely connected to the revolutionary struggle of the Laotians and the Cambodians, and Vietnam dominated this revolutionary struggle and provided guidance, so to say. But after 1975, relations between Pol Pot, that means the Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, and the Vietnamese communists deteriorated. Okay, so there are some studies, for example, on the relationship between the Vietnamese and the Cambodian communists, I mean the Khmer Rouge. And for example, by Chris Gosha, who wrote lots of books on Vietnamese history, and another German colleague, who also made use of think they mainly made use actually of Vietnamese language sources. So they tried to find out why Vietnamese relations between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Cambodian Communist Party that had been very close, for until the end of the 1960s, deteriorated so much, and why then actually a war broke out between Vietnam and Cambodia. So Vietnam occupied Cambodia at the end of 1978. So there are some studies, and there are also some new studies on so Laos during the war, and on Cambodia during the war. Whether anybody so far has made use of Cambodian sources that maybe provide new insights on, let's say, the Vietnam War, I don't know. I have never heard. No. There are only actually the group of scholars. I mean, abroad. I'm talking about foreign scholars who do studies on modern Cambodian history is very small. So it would be maybe quite interesting to have a look at Cambodian archives, and although I have no idea whether there is, whether documents still exist in the Cambodian archives that cover the Vietnam War.
Then I found one thing, that is you skipped one slide. You skipped one slide. Yeah, that's about the something, the victim of division. And you just in our this
That was this man.
yeah. So right. Can you give us a supplementary explanation?
Yeah, I skipped that because I was afraid that I get into trouble with the master of ceremony. No. So this slide shows a writer. His name is Phu Thang, who wrote a long book on the first Indochina War, and about a Vietnamese division fighting against the French. And it's a very long book, like 500 pages long and so on. And the problem is that in this long book, there is a short paragraph that created problems. So he really got into trouble. And in this short paragraph, an officer, a Vietnamese officer, gives a speech to the soldiers, and he said, war is something horrible, so many people die, and then he goes on just complaining, that about, the dark side of the war. And so just, 3 or 4 sentences. And Phu Thang then became target of during this campaign against modern revisionism. So he was criticized for spreading defeatism. That means undermining the moral of the Vietnamese people who are just preparing to fight the American imperialists. And so he became target of this campaign, and he then went back to returned to his native village somewhere in the Red River Delta, and never published again. And so he is, so one of those targets of this campaign against modern revisionism on the cultural front. And there were some others. Some others who later then were even arrested. So he was still comparatively lucky, but for the rest of his life, he just worked as a farmer. And before, he was a quite well-known writer here, but because of like a short paragraph, in which he let an officer say something about the horror of war, he was sidelined, and so this is of course closely related to what I mentioned, that at that time there were lots of films made in the Soviet Union that were shown in Vietnam. Actually, most of the movies, in that time, that were shown in Vietnam at that time were made in the Soviet Union, and very famous film directors, and so those films presented a nuanced picture of the Second World War. So they, on the one hand, they showed the heroism of the Soviet soldiers in the war against the German fascists, but they also showed the negative side of war. And I guess these films were so popular in North Vietnam because people, of course, they had experienced also the horror of war in the war against the French. But the party leadership among Les Ones thought, now we just have to prepare the Vietnamese people, in North Vietnam, they have to mentally prepare for this war effort against the United States. So, and we ban all those books and films.
Was he
No, he was not in prison, no. But there were others who went into prison in 1967, and they stayed in prison for 6-7 years without any trial. And there were also, and then there were others whom I met who were not thrown into prison, but who, for example, were not allowed to work in their, as writer anymore. So one old man, he told me that he then worked as a cyclo driver, like a rickshaw driver, just, to survive. And also although he was never put on trial, and also the other people, but they were isolated within the North Vietnamese society. And everybody knew that they were in trouble. So people did not greet them and did not, talk to them. And so, of course, that was maybe even worse than, driving a cyclo.
I have another short question, sir. So on the slides, so you introduced the special phenomenon of the Vietnamese war studies. So you said the members of Vietnamese diaspora, the second generation Vietnamese, are increasingly interested in the history of their homeland or their homeland of their parents. So I was wondering what the tendency of their studies is. For example, simply said, if it's more closer to that of the historiography of Vietnamese Communist Party, or it is more close to that of all the other English academics. So I was wondering if they're playing a role to spread the historiography of Vietnamese Communist Party, or the opposite side, or it depends on the writers.
Good. First of all, these, American Vietnamese who belong to the second generation, they are just part of the international world of Vietnam War scholars. So they are not they are not just like a separate group. They have positions in the US, especially in the US. I think it's actually quite a common or widespread phenomenon that some, maybe not, not the majority of second generation Vietnamese living abroad, belonging to the Vietnamese diaspora, then get interested in the homeland of their parents. So they learn some Vietnamese at home. They cannot really speak fluent. They are not really fluent in Vietnamese, but they learned something about Vietnam and about the Vietnam War, via I don't know what their parents told them, or their grandparents or whatever. And they just want to know more, right? And and many of them, interestingly, write about South Vietnam. So, and many write about South Vietnam, and they usually, what they do is they reassess the history of South Vietnam, for example, of this president Woonkyung Yeo. So they don't present him as a puppet, but they say it's more complicated. He had some agency, and in the end he was not successful, but he had some agency. So I would say many of them are interested in South Vietnam, which of course is also not by coincidence, because that's where usually their parents were born. And usually their parents, they talk about, they talk about, South Vietnam before 1975. And I guess many of their parents will remember South Vietnam before the Black April. So they don't say liberation, of course, of Saigon. They say before the Black April. So they remember that time in nostalgic terms. So they say, this was wonderful. And then some of the children, they start to do research, and then they find out that that what their parents taught them is not really correct. So that, South Vietnam before 1975 was no paradise. It was very authoritarian. But also, South Vietnam was not a puppet state completely dependent on the US. So I just read an article by one representative of this group, who then said that she actually had very, difficult discussions with her father, who completely disagreed what she wrote. But what she writes then also, a lot of those books, that these second generation American Vietnamese write will not please the authorities in Vietnam. And so, and of course, the largest group, it lives in the US, because that's where the largest Vietnamese diaspora is, or the largest Vietnamese community outside Vietnam is in California. But there are also lots of Vietnamese overseas Vietnamese in, France or Germany or Australia and so on.
Any more questions? I think many of you have already asked questions, but so let me ask you a very quick question about the kind of intellectuals. As far as I remember, in the 90s or the early 21st century, there are people who kind of resisted this kind of lesser official history, official narrative of the government, like the intellectuals in Vietnam, like Bao Ninh or Dong, and then they were kind of oppressed and they were imprisoned, or their books were banned inside. But in the international kind of the scholarly world, they were welcomed and celebrated, by the scholars in the United States and Europe. So what's going on now? Is this 20 or 30 years ago it was? So now are there this kind of distant intellectuals who resist the official narrative of the government? Or?
Right. So in the 1990s, that means in the first decade of the reform period, so there was much more freedom, much more space for Vietnamese writers or filmmakers, film directors to, for example, to present the Vietnam War in a different way. And of course, the most famous example is this writer Bao Ninh, who wrote a book. It's called "The Sorrow of War." Sorrow of War, of course, is about the bad, the other side of the war. It's not only it's not about the heroic struggle of the Vietnamese people, but it's about all kinds of problems that people face during the war and traumas and so on. And so this book became famous also in Vietnam. I think there is also a Korean translation of the book. There is an English translation, and so he also was allowed to travel abroad. But then I think in 1992, he also was awarded a literary prize in Vietnam. But then he was also criticized by many people, and so for some time he was not allowed to travel abroad. Since then, Bao Ninh has not really published a lot, unfortunately. But okay, what's going on now? That's a good question. There is one famous Vietnamese journalist. His name is Huy Duc, and some years ago he wrote a very interesting 2-volume book that also covers the Vietnam War, and the that covers the Vietnam War and the post-war development. And this man has very obviously close relations to some leading Vietnamese politicians. So he has had access to lots of sources. And this book is one of the most interesting books in Vietnamese language about modern Vietnam. But it was not published in Vietnam. It was published abroad, I guess in California. It's called like Ben Dang Guoc. That means something like on the victorious side. So he talks about how the victorious North, presented the war, and he gives some insight, provides some inside information. And he also was allowed to travel abroad, and he attended academic conferences, and there is a special issue of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies with interview with him. So, but he was arrested last year, or even 2 years ago, and he was arrested, and then nobody knew anything about the circumstances, and he was, a few months ago, he was then put on trial and sent to prison for, I don't remember exactly, 2 or 3 years. And of course, this shows somehow, the current atmosphere in Vietnam, because for the last few years, I quoted from this resolution from 2016. So for the last decade, the party chief Nguyen Phu Trong, who passed away last year, he very much propagated like orthodox Marxism, Leninism, and he really tried to make sure that people, party members, but also non-party members, follow the party line, and so the space for, let's say, civil society in Vietnam, has become smaller and smaller. And so he passed away last year, and his successor is his name is Do Lam, and he was Minister of Public Security for 10 years. So he is a representative of this faction, of the security faction. And I'm quite sure that things in this respect will not improve.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Grossheim, for a wonderful presentation. It's very interesting to know about the new trends, but it is that for the final explanation about the current situation. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you again, and give him a big hand, please.